Okay. Okay, so hello to everybody. As always, thank you for coming together here for yet another week of History Matters and So Does Coffee. This week, we're going to be talking about, as I suggested, tweeting and on the teaser and everything else, we're going to be talking about foreign influence. Obviously, in the early republic and why it was a big deal in the early republic. And then I don't think I'll have to say a lot about why it's a big deal now, but I will talk a little bit about connecting past and present, and as always, how thinking about the past helps us think about the present. But before I plunge in, as always, my partner in crime, Matt, I will turn things over to him. For those of you who are new or need a reminder, he will explain how to ask questions after I'm done saying whatever it is I'm saying.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So our rules are pretty simple. We ask you to feel free to use the chat so long as it's germane to what we are talking about in some way, shape, or form. So please feel free to use the chat for chatting and comments, knowing that we'll be monitoring that, but not really doing too much with it while Joanne's talking. If you do have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A. It just makes our life a little bit easier for us to keep track of who asked what and when. So please put your questions in the Q&A. In the meantime, my weekly plug for the National Council for History Education is that if you do like what we do here with this program and with others, please make sure that you join us at www.nche.net or follow us at HistoryEd on Twitter or on Facebook, which is NC4HE. One last plug that I want to get while folks are still here and not at the after party, which is yesterday we were pleased to announce a series of webinars on critical conversations on race and equity, race, ethnicity, and history, which will happen towards the end of July, leading up to a summit on equity, which will be August 4th through 6th. So we have some really great programming and really astounding people that are going to be participating in that. So please watch out for that and join us for some or all or many of those events. So with that, I turn it back over to Joanne, and I will hide away and listen to her bestow us with some knowledge.
Thank you very much. Okay, so here we go. Okay. Foreign influence. There are many obvious reasons why I chose this topic, and I'm sure it will need to be addressed in another way at some point. But somehow this week, and actually now that I think about it, it might have to do with the fact that I watched the Hamilton movie, which you'll understand why I'm saying that in a moment. But it has always been a big deal, right? The fear of foreign influence, as long as there has been a government of the United States, under the Constitution particularly, there has been fear of foreign influence. And it largely has to do with the fact that we're a republic, and at the time that we're a republic and not a monarchy. Monarchies were, a done deal. People knew what they were, people knew how they worked. Republic, because it relied so much on public opinion and voting and direct representation and all of these other things that were, even if they were reflected to a degree in, for example, the British monarchy, in a republic, they're extreme. And what it means if a government is more small d democratic or is a republic and thus really governed by the public in that way, it means that there are a lot of soft edges and vulnerabilities, right? More so than in a monarchy or a government that has an obviously stronger hand. So in the early republic, these were, I probably have talked about this in the past, but that generation of people were really, really firmly rooted in the past to some degree and definitely educated in the past. And, Madison's the most extreme example of this, but when Madison, for example, was getting prepared for the constitutional or the federal convention, he read about republics, all republics that he could find, ancient, modern. He wanted to understand what has happened to republics over time, why it happened, and what perhaps the convention could do to prevent it from happening to what might be a new republic. The assumption was, and this is very Enlightenment-esque thinking, right? That there are rules that govern the universe, that there are universal rules, and if you can figure out the rules, then you can make things better, right? Ideally. So in his thinking, you know, if he could figure out what republics, why they went down in the past, perhaps that wouldn't happen now. And one of the things that that study would have made clear, on the one hand, it makes very clear that demagogues are a threat to a republic. On the other hand, it would have made very clear that foreign influence can be a threat to a republic. So, and this is why I suddenly realized maybe why I thought of foreign influence this week, because I agonize, every week I agonize over what's appropriate and is there something in the news, or anyway, in this case, I'm about to quote you a few lines from George Washington's farewell address. This is probably why I thought of foreign influence, because I watched the Hamilton movie and they sing the farewell address, which is one of many favorite things. But at any rate, I wanted to read you a few lines from it. And, you know, Washington, farewell address, I suppose, is accurate. He was giving parting advice, things that you'd better think about, knowing full well that he was trusted, that things that he said would be listened to in a probably less partisan way than other people might listen to it. So he knew he had a special place as someone articulating these sentiments. And this is from his farewell address. I want to find the passages I want to read. Okay, so first, he says, there are two sentences that I want to read here. The first is about party passions, right? Party politics. And in 1796, and he gives this address, or he publishes this address in September of 1796. In 1796, what was coming up in November was the first real presidential election, right? Because as long as Washington said, I'm in, then people are going to basically vote for him. But as soon as he said, well, I'm not going to have a third term, now suddenly Fisher Ames of Massachusetts said it was like the dropping of a hat. It was like, boom, you're off. Suddenly everyone understood that this was a real election. So he knows that's coming in a couple of months. So this is his advice. And one of the things he says is party passions. Party passions are dangerous. And here's one of the many reasons why. Party passions open the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Okay, that's kind of laying it out. Then he gets even more urgent a little bit further down in the address. And I have to read this partly because there's this parenthetical plea, which shows you how important this is to him. He says, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, parentheses, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens. So this is urgent. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. That's pretty direct. And, you know, Washington himself was not the most direct writer. His sentences tend to sort of meander a lot. You know, having Hamilton around to write for him was a good thing for him. In this case, in the case of the farewell address, as the Hamilton musical and film suggest, he asked Hamilton to write up a draft, then, and Madison contributed material as well. And then Washington, you know, sort of went through it and made it sound like him. But Hamilton had a lot to do with the farewell address. So part of what I'm doing in quoting the farewell address is segueing neatly into what I really want to talk about, the document that I want to talk about, which is Hamilton's truly bizarre suggestion for a national seal. It's very much born of these kinds of fears of foreign influence, but in his case, and in the case of a lot of Federalists, what they're really fearing when it comes to foreign influence was France. They were fearing the French Revolution. They were fearing what to them looked like, and in many ways was, a social revolution, right? A dramatic seemingly uncontrolled social revolution, and Hamilton and his Federalist friends were truly worried that that would contaminate the United States, that threat had to be kept away. That's some of the logic behind the Alien and Sedition Acts. There's also just some blunt partisan sort of logic behind the Alien and Sedition Acts, but Federalists were truly scared that somehow or other France would taint the United States, and then everything that was happening there would happen here, because the United States is only a few years old at this point and a highly impressionable youngster of a nation. So what's happening when Hamilton writes this document is that events in France are becoming increasingly frightening, and there's going to be an election coming up. Hamilton's document is a little bit earlier, but still, they're looking ahead, they're thinking about France, and in the lead up to this 1796 election, this doesn't necessarily influence Hamilton's document, but it's worth noting that it was in the air. There was a lot of talk, beginning I think more in October, that French minister Pierre-Auguste Adet, somehow or other, he's a French minister, that he was somehow trying to enable France to have an undue influence over the presidential election of 1796 because France would prefer Jefferson for president. And Adet did a number of things. He wrote a sort of hint-filled document to the Secretary of State that he also punished, basically saying that, hinting that France was going to suspend relations with the United States, but that if Jefferson won in the coming election, that for sure would prevent war. It wasn't that blunt, but the meaning was clear. And so here is, the fear brought to life. Here's the French minister saying, yeah, I am gonna hint at interfering and interfering and all kinds of, the revolution's scary, this is scary, everything is scary, and things are particularly scary before presidential elections. So this is the context for Hamilton's document. And in the end, I should say, before I launched the document, in the end, Adet's attempt to influence public opinion to support Jefferson, not only did Jefferson not win, but it helped to some degree to turn public opinion against the Republicans and France, because it suggested to some people that maybe the Republicans were tools of a foreign power, right? Not a wave of public opinion, but still enough that there was some perception that something shady was going on there. Okay, now let's get to Hamilton's document. It truly is. I say this every week. You could force me to name, like, I don't know, my 5 top Hamilton documents, and this would be one of them. Not necessarily because it's more important, but because it's weirdly Freudian and so revealing and not public, right? So people don't know about it. Really, it's a memo he made for himself and did absolutely nothing with, but it's so insane. And it so clearly reveals the mood of the moment. Okay, so for those of you who haven't seen it, Hamilton, for some reason, sat down and decided to come up with a seal for the United States, a national seal. And he first describes what it looks like, and then he goes into this extended explanation of why he chose the symbols that he chose. And when you read it, one of the first things that becomes screamingly apparent is that he has no graphic sensibility at all, right? It's insane. So I'll describe it, and then I'll explain why I love talking about it. I don't know if I'll be able to do it here. I'll decide. At any rate, he says, okay, imagine, put this down so I can act it out. Imagine that there's a globe, and on one side you can see Europe and part of Africa, and there's a colossus, a giant, with 1 foot in Europe and 1 hovering towards the United States. Then imagine that standing in North America is a figure that represents the United States with a spear and a shield being defensive. I think he says in a defensive attitude. And the Colossus is wearing various trappings of the French Revolution, right? A liberty cap, a number of other things that clearly suggest the Colossus is the French Revolution. So when Hamilton sits down and says, what shall our national seal be? It's like a howling scream of anxiety about the French Revolution. I mean, I tend to act out this document when I talk about it. I once did it when speaking at a high school years ago, and when the principal came up afterwards to thank me, he said it was the first time they had modern dance in a lecture, because to act it out, you have to be the Colossus, like looming, and then you have to be, you know, it's sort of the national seal. It's insane. Logical, and that's why I love it, is because it represents precisely what some Federalists would have been thinking. Continuing the insanity is when he then describes the various symbols and why the symbols are there and what they represent. And if it isn't complicated and bonkers enough, he then says, and you know, if it doesn't make the image too complicated, I think we need Neptune also in the sea with the waves. It's like, no, Hamilton, no Neptune, no waves, don't do it. So it's good that this did not happen. Now, someone said, sounds like a political cartoon. In some sense, yes, it has all of the complexity of a political cartoon of that time period. A national seal, not so much. But what I love about it is, you know, when you're looking at primary documents, or certainly when I'm looking at primary documents, and Housen's really good at this, I'm always looking for hints of underlying assumptions and unspoken thoughts, right? And you have to have some concrete evidence for that. You have to look for patterns or look for word choice or really find a way so that you're not just saying, oh my, he seems upset, but that you're drawing it from evidence. This is a lot of what I do in my history, is essentially use emotion as evidence. But to find emotion and to interpret it, you have to be really aggressively systematic. This document, it's like, he's just laying it out there. Here you go, Joanne. It's what I'm thinking about France and the United States and how scary it really is, by Alexander Hamilton. So that's why it's a favorite document. And I keep saying it's bonkers. I don't actually mean that, because the point of it is it's totally logical to him, and that's the important part. Okay, so that's the document. Obviously, as I said at the outset, I don't have to say very much about how this relates to where we are and where we're going to be in a few months. I do think that, and this is true about many topics, this is one of many, that a lot of Americans aren't aware of the threat. You know, I sometimes on Twitter, I talk about how, you know, Jefferson thought that all Americans needed, or all white male Americans needed, at least a couple of years of education, and some of that had to be history, so they would understand the threats to a republic, and so they could fend them off when they happen, right? Because Jefferson's the guy who wants the yeoman republic, and the farmers rise up to fight off the enemy and then go back to their farms. So he thought that people needed to be educated in certain things so they would recognize the threats. And we're in a moment where I just don't think people recognize the threats. And no matter how much we scream like, hey, you know, in foreign influence, I think that for a lot of people it just goes, pew, and it doesn't register. You know, Washington, who says how the policy and will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another, is clear, but even that isn't quite strong enough to get across the degree to which this kind of foreign influence, it kind of subsumes a nation under the influence of another. It's a real threat. So part of the reason why I chose this for this week is that's an idea that I think can't be stressed enough. I'm sure I will talk about it again, and I will find another wonderful document to do it. But it's one of many things that the people who created the government and were looking at history understood in a general way. It's a main vulnerability about this kind of government. And I'll keep howling about it forever that, you know, it's a real threat. It's not just something born of party passions, as Washington would put it. It represents a real threat. There are any number of other things going on right now that represent real threats that I think sometimes people don't realize. I've tweeted about this idea as well, that I sometimes think that Americans are so fully convinced that the United States is totally exceptional. And by that I mean, things won't go wrong here in the way that they've gone wrong in other places, right? We will be okay because we're the United States. I think that sensibility is blinding people to some of the dangers and risks that are smack in front of us. That's a lot of what I scream about on Twitter, is that very fact. And I've said that very thought, I know, more than once. This falls into that category. You know, it's like right in front of us. Party passions complicate things. Party politics make it hard to deal with things. But the American people need to understand it, because that's the starting point for any action. So that was my logic behind talking about this. And as I said, in future weeks, I will be talking about other threats that certainly they understood in this earlier generation, and then what they mean now. I will say it's not a wonderful practice to go back to the founding and say, well, they thought this, and thus we should think exactly this, because historical context matters. There are no straight lines in history. Things change and warp over time. So quoting a founder and saying, ha, I've got him saying a sentence that's important. Politicians tend to do that a lot, because if you can get a founder on your side, you know, that's good for you. I don't tend to like to do that, but this idea about the risks of foreign influence really translates well to the present. Now, I will say actually about not liking to make that kind of comparison. Yesterday, I was asked by a press outlet, what political party would Hamilton be part of if he suddenly appeared today? And first I said, none, because you can't translate. Federalist doesn't equal anything, right? And Federalist was a bunch of things that no one party represents now. Federalist was, you know, help the wealthy and big business and big government. So I said, no, you know, you can't do that. And this reporter, to her credit, was really trying to find a way to phrase the question so that I would answer it. You know, what if we're not talking about the United States? What if, and finally I just had to say, I'm really not comfortable with this question, because I just don't think, not only do I not think you can translate the founders' world and their political assumptions straight into the present, but I spend a lot of my career arguing that we shouldn't. So that's just a great example. It's very tempting to do that. And the founders, of course, are the ultimate authorities. And it's worthwhile checking in with the people who created the system to see what they thought, but no direct lines, right? We have to translate for the present. That's part of what historians do, and that's ideally what historians help everybody else do. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking in a moment, and here's my thought, and Matt can tell me if this sounds reasonable. As I said in the teaser, given that now the Hamilton film is airing, and given that on Twitter I could see, man, there are a lot of questions. What I want to do is I want to open things up for both topics, for foreign influence, and then for things that people might want to talk about regarding the film. But rather than jump back and forth between those topics, maybe we can start with foreign influence, and then after that, maybe segue into questions people might have about the film, so that it won't be like, dire important topic, isn't the movie great? And that somehow that that segue will work better. So that's my thought. First, let Matt know if you have questions about foreign influence or any of the things I just said. If you don't, we can plunge right into the film. But if you do, we'll just wait a few minutes and then make that segue. And now I'm going to change my view here. Okay, now I will turn things to Matt.
That sounds perfectly
no,
reasonable.
wait, I did it again, guys.
Oh, yes.
I'm really totally predictable. Okay, I think this might be my last mug. Oh, and I should say, some of you asked, like, can you send mugs? If you want to send mugs, I think we said last week, if you feel like it, you can send it to the National Council for History Education, care of, I guess, me. They'll send them to me. I am not in any way asking for mugs. I am allowing this to be there because enough people have asked that I would feel goofy not expressing this. And as I said last week, a friend told me, yeah, why not? Like, anyway. So guilt versus fun, both of those things right in front of me. But if you want to do that, National Council for History Education. That said, I'm going to wipe my lipstick off. Foreign influence, that's what I was looking for. And it's the Tube. It's the British Tube.
Okay.
But what I like is the motto. You can't the system. Ideally, that would be true. The system, the political system would hold firm. But I was proud of myself that it was all the way in the back of my cabinet behind like teacups. I don't know why it fell out of favor, but I did manage. This is week 14. I actually have too many mugs. But that's at least 13 times. I don't remember if I did it the first week, but that's a lot of mugs, and I'm still holding firm. So okay, now, yes, mind the gap, please, as they say on the Tube. Okay, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let Matt look at questions.
Okay, and I was enjoying that so much that I haven't looked at questions yet. Okay, so as a reminder, foreign influence first for a couple minutes, and then we're going to segue into Hamilton questions. So you have about, let's say, 7 minutes to read all 6,500 tweets that were posted here earlier. All right. Okay. It's a really good question, but oddly specific, so I don't know if we're going to be able to answer it, but I will ask it because I happen to like the series John Adams as well, the HBO series John Adams. Is it Janae? Edmund Janae, is that how you pronounce that?
Janae.
Janae. I'm terrible with pronunciations that way. So Jennifer says, I normally use the scene in HBO series John Adams when Edmund Janae tries to convince George Washington to help the cause. Is this a decent representation of what happened? I think it spells out nicely the dividing line between Hamilton and Jefferson about this topic.
Well, it's been a really long time since I saw the Adams documentary. I will say that Citizen Janae, Edmund Janae, is yet another French diplomat who tried to influence American politics. The Janae Affair is normally what this is called. And Janae pushed too far, seemingly went above Washington's head to appeal to the American people. That was not good. He ultimately gets, he gets recalled, but then he ends up living in the United States. But this becomes a controversy, and it does show some of the difference, although he goes too far, even for some Republicans. Years and years ago, I found, actually when I was writing my dissertation, that's how long ago, it's probably in Affairs of Honor, I talk about it. There's a statement in which he's trying to describe what Janae did, and he's clearly trying to justify it. And he's having a very hard time. And he's a lot of edits, new words, crossing out of sentences, because it's hard to justify that. But that is it's a good example of several things. It's a good example of how foreign affairs permeated everything in this time period. You can't, I think I said this at least last week or one other week, you can't separate domestic and foreign affairs in this period. It's one big blob of newness and anxiety. But yeah, the Janae Affair is a good example of that. I have a vaguely weird Janae related story that I'll save for the after party, and I'll move on.
Okay. Okay, so Francesca asks a good question. She was a little confused about France being seen as a threat. Weren't they allies? And if you could just clarify that point for Francesca.
Sure. Yes, good historian answer. Yes and no. Yes, the French were allies from the American Revolution. Republicans, when they saw what was happening in France, interpreted that as the spark of liberty set off by the American Revolution spreading around the world, and look, it was spreading in France. And wanted the United States to stand firm behind France. Federalists were far more wary about this, and even though there was that firm alliance during the Revolution, that people still felt great loyalty to France, but to the Federalists, there was enough chaos going on in France that they did not necessarily feel good about linking themselves with France. And given that the government was kind of in flux, it seemed unwise to do that. So there's a Neutrality Act, a Neutrality Proclamation comes out because, and of course it's when Washington is president and the Federalists, in a sense, have the upper hand, but the Neutrality Proclamation basically says, we can't weigh in here. Like we're declaring neutrality because it's just too complicated, and we want to stand by France and we love France, but this is too complicated for us. But it was a big deal and it was controversial, so it's a good question.
So Seth asked a really good question here, which is, you indicate Hamilton was concerned about foreign influence, meaning the French Revolution, but was the return to the British crown feared? So that sort of is,
yeah. So was the return to the British crown feared? Yes. Hamilton, I'm trying to decide how to answer for Hamilton. I'll put Hamilton over here for the moment. Yeah, there was some fear, and it pops up when you look in political correspondence from the period. Every once in a while, someone's like, they're just trying to open things up to welcome Britain back. A lot of the fears, when you look at them for the 1790s, sound highly exaggerated and hard to take as serious fears. But if you really think about the fact that, the government is 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that the generation of people starting that government had fought a revolution against an enormous established empire and toppled it. And now they're seeing things that look like political parties forming and dissension and things that to them suggest the republic is not sound and steady. You can understand all of these fears. The United States had no influence. Let me see if I can remember Hamilton's phrase. I'm not going to remember it, but it's something like, I don't think Americans realize the degree to which we can be really bothered, but we can't really bother others. Like, we don't have power. So some of these ideas are born of the moment. Some of these ideas are born of the newness of the Republic and the fact that it was still figuring out some pretty basic aspects about what it would be. And both Britain and France had very strong feelings about what they wanted that Republic to be and were weighing in. Diplomatic relations in this period is a constant. The United States is like stuck in this Bermuda Triangle of angst, where they say something friendly towards England and then France smacks back, and then they turn around and say, oh, no, France, we love you, and then Britain smacks back. So it was very complicated, and it was bound up with party politics. So that's a lot of what we're talking about here.
So on their Facebook, their relationship status would be, it's complicated, is what I hear you saying.
The relationship status between...
I'm just making a joke. Don't mind me.
Oh, okay.
It was a bad joke.
Oh, I got it. You're talking to somebody who isn't on Facebook. Well, I am, but I never am there. So now I get it. Thank you. If you just say it's a technology joke, Joanne, I'll just nod.
Okay. It's a technology joke. I love it. Carolyn wants to know, what was the French agenda in regards to the United States during the 1790s? Were there any specific goals that they were reaching for and advocating for Jefferson?
Well, I mean, they wanted favorable status for trade. They wanted the United States to side with France because France and England were forever at odds, right? They're long-term enemies. So if France could not only get preferred status with trade, but also just generally, that might help them in whatever conflict they had against England. So the United States, for a variety of reasons, economic reasons, political reasons, would have been useful for France. And then France had reason to assume that that made sense precisely because of what that last person asked with the question. There was an alliance, and the French did stand by and really enable the colonies to win that revolution by sending guns and ships. Hamilton lyrics, man. By sending guns and ships, and so the battle shifts, to, help really sway the revolution. So there were a lot of reasons why that France had for thinking what it thought.
Okay. We'll take two more questions for this, and then we'll switch to Hamilton the musical and see if there happens to be any overlap.
Yeah, if there's no questions about Hamilton, we can go back to. I want to leave it open because I've been hammered in the face with questions about Hamilton on Twitter. Anyway.
I am shocked to hear that.
I know, it's shocking. It's really shocking.
Lance wants to know, do you have any sense of what the main reason for the fallout between Adams and Hamilton was during the Adams administration? Was it foreign policy, domestic policy, personality conflicts? And then he mentions that he loved the 1776 reference in Hamilton.
Yes,
sit
I
down.
love that too. Sit down, John. You fat boop. Yeah, Sit Down, John. For those who don't know, 1776 is the opening of 1776, the first song in 1776. Okay. Well, so there's a evolving relationship between Adams and Hamilton. They are both Federalists. Hamilton has a habit of telling Adams what he thinks Adams should do before he's president. Like, sir, like you should be at the Capitol. What are you doing back home? Adams does not have patience generally for Hamilton. So the two, their temperament was not ideally suited. What happens during Adams' presidency is two things. First is Adams, not wanting to suggest that he's in any way better than Washington, keeps Washington's cabinet, just inherits it, right? He's like, well, how could I presume to say, well, those aren't good enough, I'm going to find my own people. Like, he's in the shadow of Washington. He keeps the cabinet, and that cabinet, they're all, or most of them, are really friendly with Hamilton. And what this means is that Hamilton had influence over the cabinet. And you can't say that they absolutely followed Hamilton's orders, but they sure checked in with him a lot. And he sure had a lot to say to them about what he thought they should be doing. Adams initially didn't know that. When he finds out, he throws a fit. Adams also was not eager to be in a state of warfare with France, and America begins drifting in that direction because the Jay Treaty is friendly towards England, and then France responds, and then relations with France get bad, and then we seem to be drifting into it becomes the quasi-war with France. Never becomes a war, but we're drifting in that direction. And Adams, to his credit, and later in life, he declared this one of the things in his presidency and maybe his life that he was most proud of. He sent diplomats. He refused to listen to the other Federalists who said, okay, war against the French, looks like that's where we are. And he says, no, I'm going to send another group of diplomats there, and we're going to figure out a way to negotiate our way out of this. And he does. But those two things together, the fact that, and Hamilton is saying to Adams, here's what you should do. And at this point, Hamilton is a lawyer in New York. It's not like he's in the government, right? He's a lawyer in New York with a lot of attitude. And when Adams discovers the degree to which Hamilton has influence over his cabinet, he throws a fit. There are people who are fired. There are people who resign. It becomes a big deal. Hamilton writes the pamphlet that in the film, Hamilton drops when he says, you boop, sit down, John. He writes that in response to that episode, basically saying, this Adams, he's horrible, but we should vote for him for president, thinking in his mind somehow, stupidly, that he'll get enough votes pulled away from Adams towards someone else that he'd prefer, and that'll all magically work, and it really, really didn't, and it was a really stupid pamphlet. But it divides, Hamilton and Adams divide the Federalist Party. So during an election, Hamilton attacks his own party's major candidate and divides the party. There is whispering. Hamilton makes gestures. He uses affair of honor talk when at some point. Not, I think he doesn't think he's going to fight a duel with John Adams, but he's clearly paving the way for him to take offense and respond. So anyway, it's wonderful. I'll stop talking about it, but there's a lot of stuff. But those are the things at the heart of it. And the important part about that is, as the question suggests, they divided the party.
Fascinating. Well, I want to leave at least 15 minutes for Hamilton questions. So, because I assume there's going to, like you said, I'm sure you're getting inundated with them. So go ahead and put any Hamilton questions you have in there. I'll start off with Mike, who said, are the recent criticisms of the last week on Hamilton and his portrayal of Aham and slavery legitimate? Do these criticisms surface when it first appeared on Broadway? I do not recall any then. The answer to that question is yes, it did pretty shortly thereafter, but go ahead and talk more about that.
Well, I have a two-part answer to this. On the one hand, when it first came out, there was a lot of talk about the fact that despite the fact that there are a handful of references to slavery, race and slavery are just not addressed, really. And, actually I'm going to come back to a comment someone made earlier, but when you look at the United States throughout its history, you can't tell that story without slavery. You can't, right? The American story is a story of people, ideals, and some pretty damn ugly realities, and how do we figure that out, and what sense can we make of that? So people looked at the play and were like, yeah, that's nice, but it boils down to, 8 white guys in a room being played by people who aren't white, and there's no slavery, and they had objections, and historians wrote about it, and it was valid. I think it's valid to point to the play and say the America that it represents, the United States that it represents, is not full or accurate. But I said a two-part answer because it's musical theater. And the fact of the matter is, if it wasn't so influential, we might not be asking this question.
Right.
It's musical theater. So my response to it is, it fit a lot of history in there for a piece of musical theater. It got a lot of things wrong. It's missing a lot of pretty central important things. Would I use it directly to teach students history? No. Would I teach against it? Yes, because it lays it's a good pun. It lays the stage for talking about a lot of issues, including the issues that are not there. Like the idea that, for those who know the play, in the room where it happened, there was probably an enslaved person. We don't see that, but that was probably true. So there are any number of ways in which I think it's useful. But I think we're in a moment now, I'm trying right now to write something about this actually, where history always has an immediate importance. Right now, it has an immediate topical politicized importance, and it's very hard to discuss. So I think some of what was happening in relation to Hamilton had to do with that. We don't know for absolute sure, it seems, let me put it this way, he may have dealt in the purchasing of enslaved people for Philip Schuyler, his father-in-law, who did have enslaved people living with him. And I think there's a cemetery, a graveyard of those people that just recently, I think, was commemorated in some way. But at any rate, it's not like he was pure. He was definitely not an abolitionist. And that's part of the problem too, is that the play makes an assertion that just isn't true. So it says, he's a hero anti-slavery guy. No. He's a founder who you can pin that to because he doesn't ultimately say a lot about it, but that in and of itself is indicative of something. So that's my long-winded response, is that the issue was raised when it came out, but we're in a different climate now, so the tone of it is different. And I think those are valid points to make. The question is then, what do we do with that fact that it's missing these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So switching gears, Francesca asks a really good question. As always, she does. She asks a lot of really good questions. Why on earth did Hamilton think the Reynolds pamphlet was a good idea?
Oh, man. So I have a collection, a small collection of Hamilton pamphlets. It includes the Adams pamphlet, a copy of the Adams pamphlet, 2 copies of the Reynolds pamphlet, and a pamphlet that has to do with the duel. And I call it my Dumb Things Hamilton Did collection because all bad. I'm going to make Matt spit.
You got me in dead, mid, great. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. That all by itself was highly amusing. The Reynolds pamphlet, his logic for the Reynolds pamphlet was, he was being accused of misusing Treasury funds. And the logic in his mind for the Reynolds pamphlet was, no, I wasn't misusing Treasury funds. I'm a trusted public servant. I'm a good public man. I'm not that kind of a corrupt person. I was committing adultery. And the second half of that is he needs to explain pieces of paper in which it seems like he's giving money to someone. Why is he giving money and what is the money? And so he says, well, I wasn't misusing Treasury funds and speculating. I was being blackmailed and I was making blackmail payments to the husband of the person I was committing adultery with. And being Hamilton and being the lawyer who always goes overboard, if you look at the Reynolds pamphlet, it's an explanation and then there's an appendix where he prints all of the correspondence between him and Maria Reynolds. It's like, Eliza left town and she had every reason to. In his mind, I think he was protecting his public life and sacrificing what he would have considered some of his private life or his public life. That's not surprising because at the end of his life, when he's writing like wills and last statements in case the duel goes wrong, one of the things he says is he asks his children to take care of their mother. And he says something like, he realizes he doesn't have a right to ask anything of his children because he basically wasn't present for them. He was too busy at what he was doing and he didn't attend to his family in the way that he should have. So I think throughout his life, he was sacrificing aspects of private life to his public, what he considered, sort of public mission. And the Reynolds pamphlet would have had that logic. I'll also say that committing adultery wouldn't have been, oh, he committed adultery, he can never serve again in public. The scandalous thing that he did was write a pamphlet about it. I mean, that was quite something. And it was published, a long time ago, saw a copy of it published in London. And it had like 2 little portraits in the frontispiece. And it was like the seducer, the seductress or something. And these 2, they didn't look like any of them at all, but clearly it was like, like this is juicy stuff. So I don't think really anybody thought that was a fine idea. People understood why he did it. I think if I'm right that George Washington sent him a gift of a wine cooler not long after that as a way of saying, you're having a tough time and I understand this here. But then he went and wrote, dumb pamphlet number 2, which is the Adams pamphlet. And at that point, some of his really heartfelt supporters begin to step back. One of them, a very close friend, says to another one, he does not have discretion, which is an understatement. He does not have discretion and thus he is not, we cannot follow him as a leader. So he really, he wrote his way out of being a political leader. He could be his own worst enemy that way.
There are currently no questions for Hamilton, so okay. You all know my threat, which is if there are no questions from you, there will be questions from me. So my question is, can you talk a little bit about like the one of the things that the play does is rely heavily on this trope that he wants to be the smartest man in the room. And so I think that kind of speaks to what you were just saying, this idea that in some ways he literally wrote, to be the smartest person in the room, he wrote his way out of relevance in terms of the public sphere. Is that a fair characterization of him, or do you feel like it was more complicated than that?
Well, I think I'll sort of riff off of that. I think he did think very often that he was the smartest guy in the room. I mean, I don't think he felt that he needed to do anything to be the smartest person. He just thought he was the smartest person. Mm-hmm. He also, related to that, did not take advice well, right? So writing the pamphlets, like with the Adams pamphlet, it's actually comical if it weren't for the fact that that did him damage. He actually, before he's done with the pamphlet, he writes to some Federalist friends along the lines of what Matt is saying here. Why write the pamphlet? Is it to prove he's the smartest man in the room? It isn't, and he kind of proves that he isn't. He writes to a couple of friends and says, I'm thinking of writing this pamphlet, what do you think? And there are letters between those friends, and what they're all saying to each other is, oh God, no. Like, just don't do it. Don't do it. But no one says that to him. And what they're saying to each other is, I'm not going to tell him he shouldn't do it. Like, you tell him he shouldn't do it, because if I tell him, he will never talk to me again. And they bounce that around between them. And finally, one guy steps forward, I think from Massachusetts, and says, I'll tell him it's a bad idea. He may never speak to me again for saying that, which tells you a lot. Mm-hmm. So he, when he was like, what do you think? I don't think if they had all come back and said bad idea, that he necessarily would have listened. I thought he felt good about asking, but to give you a sense of how convinced he was that he was always right, he writes the pamphlet. There's a huge uproar. It hurts his party. He wrote the pamphlet based on some of the notes that Adams's Secretary of War, James McHenry, had of a meeting when Adams blew up. He sends some of those to Hamilton. Hamilton incorporates them into the pamphlet. McHenry is pissed because he didn't want to be involved in this. Big fuss, everything is bad. McHenry is like, he's doing what a friend does. I ought to be really mad at you. He wants to be, but he can't quite be. Hamilton writes back and he's like, I'm thinking about doing a second one. Because I think I need to explain myself better. Do you have more notes? And it's just like, it's like, no.
No.
Dude.
Let it go.
Not correct. Yes, don't do it. He just really always thought he was right. Rarely does he apologize. When he does, the apology is like, I'm sorry you feel bad.
Yes.
I'm sorry I did that. He's a difficult guy. And that part of his personality enabled him to push himself forward really aggressively and helped to destroy him.
Mm-hmm. The play shows Washington as a father figure to Hamilton. Was that truly the case?
Yes and no. I feel like such a historian. Yes and no. It's clear that Washington had a real fondness for Hamilton and felt affectionate towards him. I don't know if I can say fatherly, but there were clearly feelings there that he felt kindly towards him in a personal kind of a way. Most of his letters are addressed to him as, Colonel Hamilton, blah, blah, blah. When Hamilton leaves town to get married, Washington addresses a letter to him, Dear Hamilton, right? So there's a closeness between them, and Hamilton writes about it in this extraordinary letter. So ultimately, Hamilton and Washington have a big fight. And Hamilton stalks out, and after they replace him, leaves headquarters. And then he writes this letter to his father-in-law trying to explain why he just had a fight with the most important man in the United States. And one of the things he says is, he always has, is trying to make me his favorite. He's always partial towards me. And I don't want that. I want to be recognized for my merit. I don't like that. It's not right. So Hamilton really is chafing, I think, at whatever Washington is showing towards him, not really fully understanding or liking what's going on. But so the play getting at the fact that Hamilton is very resistant to that. You know, there's the part of it where Washington keeps calling him son, and then Hamilton in the play says, "Call me son one more time." That reflects some of this feeling on the part of Hamilton that he didn't want that. He didn't want this affectionate little tie. He didn't want to be, you know, a son, although he doesn't say that. He wanted to be recognized for being this brilliant, wonderful soldier, and he wanted everybody to know that's why he was favored.
Well, it is 11 o'clock, so we've gone an hour, which is longer than we usually do, but so let's end the recorded part now, and then we'll, as usual, hang around and be a little more informal. So
those of you who want to stick for the after party, I am here. My air conditioner is on. I still have coffee. We will open things up for whatever it is you guys want to talk about.
Well, thanks everybody.
One last thing I just realized. Tomorrow at 6 o'clock Eastern time, I am taking part in something called Drinking with Historians.
Oh, yes.
And two co-hosts and I, with drink in hand, will talk history. Someone says, don't forget a plug for next week. You mean like come back next week? You definitely should come back next week. I haven't decided what I'm going to talk about. There are a lot of things actually in July that I'm going to be doing. Some of them Hamilton related, but the most immediate one is tomorrow, Drinking with Historians. You have to register. I have been told that they allow 500 people and that it's full, and that now they're going to live stream it for the other. I think that they're like up to 700 people, which makes me feel insane for being willing to drink bourbon and then talk about Hamilton. So now I'm nervous, but at any rate, that's the next event coming up. Okay, now I will shut up.
And there's something we're promoting that you're doing, very similar to your talk last week about Hamilton, coming up towards the end of July 20 something. I'll have to look.
Yeah, I didn't say anything except Friday because I have no dates.
I'd say all the dates went out of my head since we've been working on this Equity Summit, which, by the way, please register for our Equity Summit and our and the webinars that'll lead up to it, which we're calling the Critical Conversation Series. So you can see those at www.nche.net. And within hopefully a week, it'll be a brand new pretty website that we're launching. So we're very excited about that as well.
Looking forward to it. Thank you all for coming. Next week, I will remember to come with information about, I have a website, joannebfreeman.com, which is not updated, that I used to like have all my events, and then I just fell out of doing it. I will try to do that again, but that ideally within a couple of weeks will be the place where you can see what I'm doing. More important than that, thank you guys for coming. See you next week. I will come up with a wonderful topic and a wonderful document for next week, and have a safe week until then.